Okay, the second PIP proposal is again in the category of improving traditional mass transit, and that's to increase frequency on a number of the high patronage routes of the MTA. Now this week we happen to be starting BRT light service in the Nolensville corridor, so that brings to 5 the number of key MTA corridors that have hit the sweet spot of between 10 and 15 minute peak frequency. This chart I'll explain a little bit. At the local level, again, thousands of Nashvillians participating in our in-motion planning process have articulated simple, frequent service among their key wishes for improvement. The chart on the right shows results from national research that basically says once you get service to a point where frequency is between 10 and 15 minutes, say in the 10 to 12 minute corridor, all of a sudden the elasticities get bigger. In other words, there's a larger ridership response because simplicity of schedule, predictability of service says I don't really have to be tied as much to that printed schedule. If I know the simplicity of the route, I can go to the stop in a reasonable amount of time. It will come along. So that's why the 10 to 15 minute range has been identified as the sweet spot. With the Nolensville improvements that are occurring this week, that brings to 5 as the number of our highest ridership routes that meet that 10 to 15 minute criteria, leaving 8 of the top 13 corridors as still falling somewhat below that, and anywhere in the 20 minute to 40 minute, which is a challenge. Coming back to Mr. Riebling's question of the last session, this one actually would require capital investment up front because these frequencies would be at peak hours when the majority of our fleet is out on the road. This PIP would request capital funding in year 1 to acquire 8 additional buses to the fleet, so an overall increase in the fleet size of 8 buses. And then by the second year, because of the lead time on delivery, we would be seeking operating funds to support those operations on lines like Dickerson Pike, Bordeaux, Shelby, and Herman routes, high patronage services that don't yet have those levels of frequency. We've relied heavily on the outcomes of Nashville Next to do our planning to date under In Motion, and that really wouldn't change in deploying services on these routes. So we would be looking to partner with Metro Planning to identify where the deployment of frequency improvements in key corridors would be most advantageous, looking at patterns related to demographics, housing trends and housing development, development trends, and employment location and what have you. And as with extended service span, we would be seeking to engage with the Mayor's Office of Neighborhoods and Metro Council to target specific locations, neighborhoods, and council districts where enhanced service were made available. Coming to projected outcomes, clearly the overall goal is increased ridership, both in terms of pure numbers, but also, frankly, in the composition of ridership, as we've seen in corridors that have gotten increased frequency. The level of what we would refer to as discretionary riders, or riders who have a choice, tends to go up, so we'd be looking at the composition of ridership to see that occur. And one of the things that's often overlooked in frequency changes is many of our current customers, particularly commuting to work or school, have to use multiple routes. They have to make transfers to do that, which in and of itself can be a lengthy process. When those routes operate very infrequently, those trips can become inordinately long. So we ran a sample, and in the chart on the right, you'll see a comparison of average commute time for a 6.5 mile trip. 6.5 miles, if you average out every MTA customer, is the average trip distance they're taking on the MTA system. So we basically took some sample trips of about 6.5 miles and said, well, okay, if your originating bus route operates at 60 minutes or less, and the bus you have to transfer to is at 60 minutes or less, what's that average travel time? Came out to about 82 minutes for a 6.5 mile trip, largely composed of that wait time for a transfer. When we looked at the routes like Gallant Road, Murfreesboro, that are operating at much higher levels of frequency, that average commute time dropped down to 29 minutes. So in terms of a quality of life enhancement, that can be a real game changer for folks commuting to or from work, school, you name it. And that kind of wraps up our enhanced service frequency.
So in the previous one, you were targeting existing riders. Is this a target for new riders?
Right.
So are there some revenue projections that you can share?
If I can find the paper relatively quickly. Not sure if we had to do over again, we'd do 4 in a row.
No worries.
Do you have that at your fingertips? What we got? Oh, I see, here it is. Revenue amount, so on a total estimated annual operating expense of $1,840,992, fare collections of about $110,541.
Okay.
Really big question. What makes this innovative?
What makes it innovative?
What makes this different than what
For
you would,
Nashville or in general?
for today? You know, what makes this something new and different than what we've been doing before?
I wouldn't say it's so much that it's new and different. It's frankly an identified service improvement that people are telling us is necessary to overcome the barrier to ridership.
I had 2 questions, and I'm a little more naive, so bear with me. This project has a smaller ROI than the extended hours.
Yes.
Can you explain if more frequency means more riders want this is so much smaller than extending hours into the evening?
Generally, on services that would attract new riders with choice, you have a longer, what I'll call break-in period. So essentially, there's a market of people today who, if we announced today you were doing extended service hours, and that's the primary target market, it might take them a while to get those extra shifts, but, there's already that latent demand. Or when you're looking at new markets, that market takes a while to build.
Okay. And
So that, the similar ROI would come, but it would take longer to get there.
Okay, so this starts at an estimated 6%. Do you think it could get to the same 11% of after hours?
That would certainly
Or would
be
it get to the
intent.
20% of what you think today is? Because it seems like a long go from 6%
Right.
to 20 versus 6% to 11.
Probably the best example is where we've seen that improvement made in the Gallant Road corridor, which is the longest standing corridor where the improvement's been made. In the period since those changes happened, we've seen about a 40% increase in ridership. So we're now getting consistent fare box return on that route to what it was before those service enhancements were made.
Last one, if I may. There seems to be 2 or 3 geographies where individuals earning the lowest wages and our service workers live. Nolensville Road, Gallatin, there's a few areas. Many cities, when I travel, the wait times are different based on where you live, and those workers get priority. Is that what this is? Is this really saying for Gallatin, Nolensville Road, and a few key areas, we're going to increase frequency to 15 minutes, so it's predictable, and then areas where more people actually use their cars and aren't riding the bus, we're okay to leave it at 30 because it's less relevant as long as we get those people from the outlying areas into the city and move them around the city more quickly? I'm trying
It's
to put
based
that
on
together.
a combination of current usage patterns, so that's reflected in what total ridership is now. So essentially, you're looking at the 7, 8, 9 routes that are next tier ridership after Gallatin, Nolensville, the corridors that have already achieved that level of frequency. So that's one piece. But what we've also seen from the demographic analysis, those also tend to be concentrations of, we measure something called a transit propensity index. So you're looking at things like job density, population density, and you're also looking at characteristics of populations that are consistent with high transit usage. That could be lower income levels, low auto ownership characteristics, or even some psychographic things like what people associate with a typical millennial behavior.
So it might be helpful if you could take, after the top 5, what's number 6, 7, 8? Is it Charlotte corridor, or is that already on the list? Or
Charlotte's there. The ones identified, after you get past Gallatin, Murfreesboro, West End, Nolensville, next ones up are areas like Dickerson Corridor, Bordeaux Corridor, Hillsborough Corridor, Shelby Corridor, Herman, 12th Avenue South, and the Jefferson Corridor.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful just to know. I'm sorry I'm hogging the questions.
be affected? In other words, when the ridership is low in those extended hours?
It would be less frequent, correct. Mhm. More frequent than now, but less frequent than 10 to 15.
Okay.
I guess it's still my same question I had last time, is this the right way to move the needle on transportation by this kind of expenditure, or is there something bigger and bolder that might be more efficient and long-term, might be more expensive today, but long-term might be more...
Yes and yes. If I'm able to go back, is it legal to go back to?
You can.
Okay.
You can do whatever you want.
If you go back to what customers have said their needs are, and it really depends on the market, fast is one that keeps popping up, particularly among discretionary riders. So frankly, to make what I'll call the big leap, whether that's in the county environment or the regional environment, the multi-county environment, where we can get travel times on transit to be competitive with private auto, that's what needs to happen to really make that big jump. That's what you see, frankly, with the Music City Star, which has that competitive advantage. So as a result, it carries, on a normalized basis, 5 times the level of ridership as the other regional commute bus corridors where they sit in traffic. And that's where you're talking about some small efforts like what BRT Light does with skip stopping, but you're also talking about long-term, larger efforts, like whether it be dedicated lanes, rail investment, or even more nominal things like what we're working with Public Works on in the Murfreesboro Road corridor in terms of signal priority, queue jump types of efforts, speeding up the boarding process, you name it.
But this isn't BRT Light on these routes. It's just more service, yeah.
Yeah, what we're actually finding, what we found in Nolensville, is certain routes have a characteristic. Murfreesboro and Gallatin worked really well for BRT Light because there was a profile that a huge percentage of ridership got on at certain stops. Now we're starting to get to where there's much more of a mix. So skip stopping becomes a challenge, which is really what BRT Light is, because all of a sudden you start shifting, you're basically passing people by in that skip stop environment. So this doesn't get us to, say, the speed advantage that a BRT Light does. It gets to the frequency advantage. But I would say, to be perfectly honest, Rich, if you were going to make the major leap, the service design would come after the infrastructure design to get you to that speed characteristic, to be blunt.
And we're time on that one, so now we're going to take a quick break, just for a second.
You want them to continue?
Actually, I need to stand up, so we are going to take a quick break.